the network was actually something which came out of the Kapitalfluktutvalget, the Norwegian government's commission for on capital flight from developing countries. It became very clear when we worked in the in Kapitalutvalget that the knowledge base and those engaged in the discussion were operating very fragmented, almost in silos. The Minister of Foreign Affairs allocated a substantial grant through the Research Council of Norway to establish a research program called Taxation, Capital Flight and Development. And in short, it was named TaxCapDev. So that's the name of the network where it comes from.
I think they really wanted to show to the Norwegian government, but I assume particularly to the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that the Norwegian Research Council was funding projects that were highly relevant for current issues.
Not only academicians, but also government officials, private sector operators, civil society organizations. Initially, the focus of the networks was related to illicit capital flows, tax havens, and so on. But actually, quite soon, we realized that was a very narrow approach. Because when it comes to taxation, state building, these issues are very much linked to domestic revenue mobilization.
If you look at this enormous literature on state building, I mean, it's just a tiny, it's very good at pointing out what states should do and why they don't do it. But it often sort of turns down to that there are political issues, political will, political conflict, blah, 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 that they don't do it. And of course, that's correct. But I mean, you cannot build a state if you don't have the funding to do it. And that funding needs to come from somewhere.
So we decided to widen the focus of the network's work to also include domestic revenue mobilization, the challenges related to developing a tax system, particularly in African countries, which have a higher degree of legitimacy, where state-citizen relations become more prominent, and also including issues related to the social contract or the fiscal social contract. The challenge was also to reach out to policymakers, to reach out to a wider audience. So it was at the very early stage in the first work program, we decided to organize a conference where all these different stakeholders could meet. And that was the conference we had in Bergen in 2016, called Lifting the Veil of Secrecy. And Sigrid Klæbo Jacobsen, I had a lot of contact with her before this was established, but I invited her to the conference, and she was very creative also in suggesting how to organize the conference, the different sessions. She led a panel, and that conference was extremely well received by the various stakeholders, and then that led to the decision that Tax Justice Norway needed to be one of the core members of the network. Tax Justice came in with new different perspectives. They reached out to a different audience than we as researchers normally reach out to. And I think we complemented each other very well.
I mean, the first conference in Bergen, which was then also hosted by the Norwegian Business School in Bergen, it was important because it capitalizing on the Panama Papers and also the work that Norwegian journalists had been involved in that regard. It created a lot of attention.
Both Norwegian and international academicians as speakers. We had civil society organizations. We had government officials from Norway and other countries, and also colleagues from various African countries.
A lot of people came to that conference. And when you start something like this, starting a new network that is basically is going to work on issues that most often they do not sort of hit media front lines. I wish they would, because they are important, but most often they don't. It was important to start with a conference that sort of gained a lot of traction, a lot of attention, and sort of made future events that the network would either organize itself or sponsor, something that people thought, okay, there is something important happening around this network. We should come and see what they are doing also on other stuff.
And it also, a following up of that was that together with Tax Justice Norway, with Sigrid, with Petter Ringstad, and a colleague from Tanzania, Prosper Ngovi, and me, we decided we need a book on taxation and capital flight. And the title of the book is actually the same as the conference in Bergen, Lifting the Veil of Secrecy, Perspectives on Taxation and Capital Flight from Africa. And that book contributed substantially to create a lot of interest and policy interest by policymakers from Africa, but also Norway. We have jointly organized a number of meetings and conferences. I mentioned the first one we had in Bergen in 2016. We had another conference in Oslo on taxation in fragile states, or fragile states and state building. That was in November 2018.
Arendalsuka has been important because we managed to convince quite a broad band of politicians and top-level bureaucrats to come and have a public discussion with us around these issues.
Then we had a conference in Bergen again in 2022, where the Nobel Prize laureate in economics, James Robinson, was the keynote speaker. But I'm not sure whether he got the Nobel Prize because of his participation in our conference, or there might probably not be a correlation. But at least we were very honored to have him there. And then we have several conferences in Dakar, Senegal. We have several conferences in Tanzania.
Dakar was important because one thing was that it brought the World Bank closer into the work we're doing in Africa. And the Dakar event was in fact the first time that somebody had tried to gather researchers and activists that work on taxation issues in West Africa together across the Francophone, Anglophone language barrier.
That's a part of the purpose of the network, also to work as a kind of a meeting point for different stakeholders, so we can share views, experiences, insights, and in a way fertilize each other.
There are two important changes to take note of that I really think that the network, although in small ways, have contributed to. One is about who is actually doing work on taxation issues. That has changed. I mean, when we started with this, I mean, there was few political scientists, few sociologists, very few anthropologists who bother around this issue. It was basically a field that was dominated by people who were, with some exception, quite hardcore economists.
When I started to work on taxation long before the network was established, it's more than 30 years ago, almost 40, I believe. But then this was an area which was for nerds. It was a niche for those with a special interest. But but very few were working on these issues. Things have changed substantially during the last 10, 15 years, where it has become an area of much broader interest, more disciplines. Another contribution for the network, which I believe, is that we have managed to show that taxation is not only about generating revenues. Of course, it's important for countries to mobilize more domestic revenues, but taxation is more than that. It is about building not only a tax system which generates more revenues, but also developing a better tax system, which has higher legitimacy, credibility, predictability among taxpayers, which is a challenge in many countries. And that message is also taken on board by policymakers in many African countries, but also among development partners, donors.
Secondly, I think that in particular during the last year, the last couple of years, the network has been quite actively in trying to sort of push more the knowledge boundaries around these issues. And why has that happened? I think it has happened because the network has contributed to these more multidisciplinary conversations, and one of the sort of crucial things now is to sort of, I think, to move beyond this idea about tax as some sort of narrow fiscal contract between populations and government. It's much more than that, and there are certain social bonds that needs to be created as well. That is probably more important than just the fiscal contract. Another thing that we see that I think has been very good, and that is that there is much more active participation in this question from African researchers, but also from African activists. And we also see this from the tax riots in Kenya to the election campaign last year in Senegal. So this is starting to sort of create much more traction also in Africa. And from the little I know from the Middle East, but also from Eastern Europe, these are important issues. You see them also now in these enormous demonstrations in Serbia after the collapse of the train station in Novi Sad, that also these issues are emerging there among the students. So there is sort of there is an increased youth awareness on these kind of issues that I think is good.
My hope now for the future of the network, or whatever comes after the formal conclusion of this network, is that more African researchers get engaged. We are working with a number of them. There is a lot of increasing interest, actually, in a number of African universities. They are now teaching tax. And I'm also a professor at the Africa Tax Institute in Pretoria, University of Pretoria, where we have a lot of students from all over Africa, and they are specializing on tax issues. Universities in other countries have also specialized courses on taxation, because there is a demand for that among younger people.
So my hope is that these conversations continue in the future, both between researchers, but also what the network also always have tried to do, and that is to have these conversations not only between a select group of academics, but also that one tries to bring in other voices, because here other voices are very much needed, because issues concerning trust, legitimacy, how to build a state, how to fix a tax system, cannot be sort of said to be the prerogative only of research.
What has been very rewarding for me is all the young people now entering this arena. I work with young, bright, enthusiastic people who really like to work in this area of applied, policy-oriented tax research. And actually, for the time being, now at my age, all the people I work with are younger and brighter and more enthusiastic than me, so the future for tax research and tax and development is very bright in my view.